You think something terrible happened?
I truly do.
It's a mystery with tantalizing clues on tape. 1 minute, this young man was a grainy image on a surveillance video. The next minute, he was gone. And police are baffled.
Welcome back, and thanks for being here. If you haven't checked out my other true crime channel yet, where I cover child-related true crime cases, then go check that out after this video. It's called A Wicked World. Now, to me, this is one of the most bizarre and confusing missing persons cases out there. A man whose life was full of potential walked into a bar and then was never again seen walking back out of that bar. And he seemed to have vanished within only 5 minutes. So where could he have gone in such a short amount of time? Brian Randall Shaffer was born on February 25th, 1979, to Randy and Renee Schaffer. He had one younger brother named Derek, whom he grew up with in Pickerington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. Brian loved listening to Jimmy Buffett as well as Pearl Jam, and his dream was to one day start a band of his own. Brian graduated high school in 1997. Then he went to Ohio State University for his undergraduate work, where he would then graduate with a degree in microbiology. Following that, Brian began studying at Ohio State University College of Medicine in 2004. During his time at medical school, Brian Shaffer had become romantically involved with another medical student named Alexis Wagoner. Brian and Alexis had a trip planned to Miami for spring break at the beginning of April 2006, and Alexis was hopeful that Brian was going to be proposing to her while they were there. But just a few days before that, on March 31st, 2006, a Friday, and the beginning of spring break for students, Brian called up his brother Derek, asking him if he wanted to go with him to dinner. But Derek had already made plans with his fiancée that night, so Brian ended up going out to a local Outback steakhouse with his father Randy. Just a few weeks prior to this, on March 6th, Brian had lost his mother to bone cancer, and even though he seemed to be handling it well, it was greatly affecting him. The father and son's dinner conversation that night included Randy discussing something with Brian in regards to his mother's inheritance, though it's not known exactly what. Randy would later say that his son looked tired at dinner that night, as he had been pulling all-nighters that week in order to cram for his exams. After dinner with his father, around 9:15 p.m., Brian met up with his friend, William Clint Florence. They were going bar hopping together. Normally, Brian would be hanging out with Alexis. However, she was unexpectedly out of town and back at home in Toledo, due to medical issues with a family pet. So while he was out that night, Brian would end up calling his girlfriend, and he would leave her a voicemail sometime between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Brian and Clint visited several drinking establishments, having a shot of hard liquor at each, as they worked their way down to the Arena District. Their first bar of the night was the Ugly Tuna Saloona, which was a bar located in the South Campus Gateway Complex on High Street in Columbus, Ohio, on the upper floor of the building to the right, and was only accessible to the public via escalator. Now, the Ugly Tuna Saloona is no longer in operation. However, when it was said to be a rather sketchy place by locals, saying that when they were there, they felt the need to keep their hand over their drink and be aware of their surroundings at all times. It's also been said that the bouncers at this bar were known for breaking up groups of college kids, letting some in, and turning some from the group away, testing these college kids' friendships, and when they were drunk too. After midnight, Brian and Clint met up with one of Clint's friends, Meredith Reed, at the Short North Tavern. They would have one shot each here before Meredith would then drive them back to where they started, at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Here, she joined them for one last round. The three were caught on CCTV cameras at 1:15, riding the escalator up to the bar. Now, at the bar that night, there were other people that Brian knew. There were other medical students there. In fact, about 4 or 5 other male students were meeting Brian out that night. Brian would again be seen on camera standing outside of the Ugly Tuna Saloon at 1:55 a.m. At that time, Brian was seen briefly speaking to two women who were named Brighton and Amber. Brian hadn't known these two women until that night. However, his friend Clint had known both of them prior to this. It said that Brian was flirting with both of these girls and possibly got one of their numbers as well. According to them, Brian was going to walk them to their car that night as they were both really intoxicated. However, he changed his mind for some reason, though neither one of them could remember why. After Brian is seen moving off camera, he then re-entered the bar. It said that then Brian told his friends that he knew someone who was in the band, so he was going up to the stage to say hi. It's possible that he had a distant connection to one of the band members, a friend of a friend, though that hasn't been confirmed. So when the bar closed, just a few minutes later at 2 a.m., Clint and Meredith were rather confused when they couldn't see Brian anywhere. They went around looking throughout the bar, checking the bathrooms as well, but he was still nowhere to be seen. Both Meredith and Clint would call his cell phone. However, it went straight to voicemail. It said that Brian and Clint had actually gotten into a disagreement that night at one of the bars. Nothing physical, just a verbal disagreement. So did Brian just turn off his phone in order to avoid Clint and Meredith? And maybe he just took an emergency exit in order to avoid both of them. So after a while of not finding Brian, Clint and Meredith decided that he likely had just taken off, and they went home. Brian had in fact been known in the past to take off on his friends during nights out. Throughout the next couple days, Saturday and Sunday, both Alexis and Brian's father would repeatedly try to call his cell phone. But there was no answer. He was then scheduled to fly to Miami with Alexis on that Monday, but he never showed up to the airport. It's at this point that Brian's family called up the Columbus police and reported Brian as missing. Right away, police began their search for Brian, and they started at the Ugly Tuna Saloon where he was last seen. Since that area of Columbus has an extremely high crime rate, the building that the Ugly Tuna Saloon is in, as well as businesses nearby, had installed multiple security cameras. These cameras, however, had not recorded Brian leaving the Ugly Tuna Saloon that night. Not the camera out front of the bar that had captured him earlier that night, nor the cameras that were at the other exits. It is possible that Brian changed his clothes, put on a hat, kept his head down, and avoided the cameras altogether. However, police did a head count of people entering and then exiting the bar. They counted hundreds of times, and every time there was one less person seen exiting than there was entering. Then there's also the possibility that Brian left the building via another route other than the main entrance. There was a surface door right outside the Ugly Tuna that was generally not used by the public, and was only a short distance from where Brian had last been seen. This exit led to a first-floor hallway, which featured access at the time to a construction site that had its own exterior exit. This area, however, would have likely been difficult to walk through when sober, never mind when intoxicated, as Brian likely was at the time. Then, it's possible that the cameras outside just somehow missed Brian, as one was said to be operated manually and the other panned the area. Then, there's the emergency exit that was located inside the Ugly Tuna. No alarm from the emergency exit door went off that night, either because nobody went down that way or the alarm on the door was not armed at the time. Since Columbus has the most security cameras out of any city in Ohio, police next looked at the footage from other bars to see if any of the cameras could explain how Brian had exited the Ugly Tuna Saloon. However, footage from cameras at 3 other bars showed no sign of him. Additionally, flyers bearing his picture and showing a tattoo on his upper right arm of a stick figure logo from the cover artwork for the single of Alive by Pearl Jam, one of his favorite bands, were posted widely. The search for Brian then began to fan out away from the bar, with police and their dogs inspecting waste bins and dumpsters. They were also asking any residents in the area if they had seen Brian that night or since. Police even persuaded the city of Columbus to let them search the sewers. However, they found nothing there. As I had said, police had searched all the dumpsters and trash bins in the area, all except for one that was said to be outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona, but had been emptied prior to police's search for Brian. After searching miles away from the bar where Brian had last been seen in every direction, police began considering other possibilities besides accident or foul play. Since Brian's mother had recently died, it was speculated that maybe he had just temporarily gone away into solitude to grieve. During the next few days of his disappearance, 50 cops were searching for him at any given time. Brian's friends and family were also questioned, and they passed lie detector tests. That is, except for his roommate and friend, Clint, who refused to take a polygraph and lawyered up immediately. And for some reason, even though the two women that Brian had last been seen chatting with outside the bar were questioned by police, they were never asked to take a polygraph. Brian's father, Randy, however, said that he wholeheartedly believed that the two women had nothing to do with his son's disappearance. Brian's girlfriend Alexis actually went to Brian's apartment the day after he had last been seen, and while his car was parked outside of his King Avenue home, Brian was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing inside his apartment either that seemed to be amiss, no signs of struggle, and nothing missing. As the search went on for Brian, there was also no activity detected on his bank accounts or his cell phone. Every night for several months, Alexis, who longed for answers as she missed Brian so incredibly much, would call his cell phone every day in the hopes that maybe one day he would answer. And while her calls always went to voicemail, one night in September, it rang 3 times. In her excitement, Alexis continued to call, and though it continued to ring, no one ever answered. Brian's cell phone carrier, Singular, however, said it may have just been a computer glitch. But one of the girls who had been at the bar that night that Brian was seen talking to was interviewed, and she had previously worked for a cell phone carrier herself and said that a computer glitch was not something that would have just happened like that. Now, as Brian's cell phone was not GPS enabled, the exact location could not be determined, but a ping was detected at a cell tower in Hillard, about 14 miles away from Columbus. The police would receive many tips in regards to Brian's disappearance, from people saying that they had seen a homeless man in Tijuana that looked like him, to possible sightings of Brian in Michigan, Texas, and even Sweden, but none of them panned out. At a Pearl Jam concert later that year in Cincinnati, the lead singer, Eddie Vedder, took time between songs to ask for tips in Brian's disappearance, but unfortunately none of that proved to be useful either. Brian's father, Randy, even consulted a psychic at one point, who told him that his son's body was in the water somewhere near a bridge or pier. So Randy, along with Derek, Brian's younger brother, and some other citizens who were very interested in his case, bought waders and spent much of their free time along the shores of the Olentangy River, which flows through Columbus adjacent to the OSU campus. They searched in vain for Brian's body near bridges. This also led police to briefly consider the highly disputed smiley face killer theory. Brian, under this theory, would have been the serial killer's only victim whose body hadn't been found. Columbus police eventually rejected any connection between the killer and Brian's case. Brian's family slowly began to lose hope that he might still be alive. If he is alive, Brian Shaffer today would be 45 years old. And the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released a digital mock-up of his face to reflect that age progression in hopes that someone might miraculously spot him should he still be alive. Now, of course, there's many theories about what actually happened to Brian that night, one being that he disappeared on his own accord and started a new life somewhere else. But most of Brian's family insisted that there was no motive for him to fake his disappearance, and it did seem he had more to look forward to than to escape from. There was, however, a time that Brian had taken off 2 years prior for about a week and hadn't told anyone until he had already left. Brian's cousin, however, thought differently than most of her family. She believes that Brian did plan on leaving on his own accord. According to this cousin, Brian had seemed extremely distressed about his mother's death, even showing up to her funeral completely intoxicated. And another theory that those close to Brian tend to dismiss is that he tried to take himself out of this world. Brian's family and friends said they never detected any signs of depression in him. They claimed that while he was grieving over the loss of his mother a few weeks prior, he was handling it well. But shortly after Brian's mother Renee had passed away, in a phone call to his girlfriend Alexis, he told her he was having difficulty coping and she should move on to someone new. Not long after that, however, Brian took back his words and asked her to go on vacation with him to Miami. There's also the theory that Brian somehow died inside the bar, and then the business owner disposed of his body to avoid any legal problems. But would a business owner really risk disposing of a body in order to avoid other legal issues? That would have also been very difficult without anyone else inside the business knowing what was going on. And for that many people to keep quiet at once, I just don't see that as plausible. Since the neighborhood that the Ugly Tuna Saloon was located in had a very high crime rate, there's the possibility that Brian was mugged or attacked after he left the bar that night. Especially if he had used an unmonitored exit that opened up to the construction site. Or maybe he just used the emergency exit and was somehow not picked up by any of the cameras. There are some people who also believe that since Brian was so drunk, maybe he fell into wet concrete on the construction site and was never found. However, it's said that the small amount of concrete that was used would not have been enough for Brian to have fallen into and then never have been found again. There's also been speculation online that Brian's friend Clint was a drug user. Although I don't know if there's any proof of that. But if true, could Brian have been in the wrong place at the wrong time due to his association with Clint? Could he have witnessed something? Why hasn't Clint agreed to take a polygraph test? Does he know more about Brian's disappearance than he initially let on? Brian's family believed so. Tragically, though, Randy Schaffer would never have the chance to find out what had happened to his eldest son. In September of 2008, a heavy windstorm hit central Ohio. And while in his yard, a branch broke off from a nearby tree, fatally striking Randy. Neighbors wouldn't find his body until the next morning. And in the condolences or guest book section of his online obituary, a signature was entered that read, "To Dad, love Brian, from the U.S. Virgin Islands." An investigation took place after that, and it was found that the post had actually been made from a computer in Franklin County, Ohio, and was just a cruel hoax. So it's said that Brian Shaffer's phone had actually pinged a few times in the days following his disappearance. Not the pings that came from Alexis's phone calls in September, but ones just days after he disappeared. These pings were said to be located in the area around the bar, meaning that Brian had likely left the bar. It's said that some of these pings came from the west side of Columbus, near Hillard and the 270 Outer Belt. There was also said to be a ping that happened months later. The ping came from an industrial park area, near a tech recycling company called eCycle. There was also one that had come from near the college campus either the night he disappeared or the following day. And interestingly enough, the public computer, where the hoax post on Randy Schaffer's obituary page had come from, is right around the corner from the eCycle address. Coincidence? Retired police officer John Hurst said at one point that Brian, quote, got exited out of the building, end quote, meaning that he had left via the construction plywood doors downstairs and across from a Wendy's. It said that tracker dogs had possibly picked up Brian's scent, but it had ended at the parking lot next to the Wendy's, indicating that he may have gotten in a vehicle from there. So what really did happen to Brian Shaffer that night? I think that he did leave the bar at some point, but somehow was able to avoid the security cameras. I think that's much more likely than a big cover-up by a business owner or owners. But what happened to him after that? Maybe he was mugged and killed. Maybe he saw something that he wasn't supposed to see, then killed. Either way, after Brian was murdered, maybe he was put into the dumpster that police never had a chance to search before it had been emptied. But what do you think? This is a confusing case, and I feel like Brian will never be found unless someone starts speaking up, because there's someone out there that has to know something. Thank you to all the patrons of A Wicked World. Now, there's even more of A Wicked World on Patreon. So check it out at patreon.com/awickedworld or use the Patreon app. You'll have access to exclusive videos each month and more. Any support truly helps to make sure the victims never get forgotten and to highlight the shortcomings of society associated with each case. Do you have a suggestion for a case you'd like to see me cover? If so, send me an email at awickedworldtruecrime@gmail.com.